Clive Thabo Lewis died on the 3rd of November 2016. He was released on medical parole in the year 2015 after having spent 22 years in prison for his involvement with the killing of Chris Hani, who was the leader of the South African Communist Party and also the commander of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing of the ANC. After his release from prison, Thabo Lewis was not allowed to speak to any media, and he was not allowed to leave his house for that matter. We were, however, to secure an exclusive interview with him, which is the only interview that he has done since his release from prison. After Thabo Lewis's death, it was said that he took all his secrets with him to the grave. But during our 1 hour long interview with him, he spoke extensively about his life, about his involvement with politics and his experiences during the early 90s, the killing of Chris Hani, his battle with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, his years in prison and the assassination attempts on his life, his battle for medical parole, and his experience after having been released from prison. Clive Thabo Lewis, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. Let's jump right into the interview. And the first question I want to ask you is, I think the big important question is, why did you kill Chris Hani?
Chris Hani was a hardline communist who was determined at all costs, even to laying the country to waste, to achieve his political aims. He was a radical. He was uncontrollable by the ANC hired authorities. He was a man who targeted civilians in preference to military targets. And as far as we were concerned, he was public enemy number one.
Well, we'll delve into the Chris Hani topic a bit later in the interview. But if we take it a step back, you were, I think, about 12 years old in 1948 when the National Party took over. How did the politics of South Africa and of the National Party in particular influence you in growing up?
Well, I lived right through the so-called apartheid era. I was very aware of what was going on because my father encouraged me to read newspapers at a young age. So I knew it was happening with the war. And I observed that there was a big influx of African people from the rural areas into the cities looking for work, an uncontrollable wave of people. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. We talk about people who were totally illiterate. They couldn't read, they couldn't write. And all of a sudden, these were landed on urban areas. And it was quite clear from that situation that the National Party, who was the government in 1948, had to do something to ensure control, because if you study the history of South Africa, you will see that before 1948, before the National Party took power, there were a number of what people refer to as apartheid laws already in operation. They were in operation to ensure good order in the country and to assure that there was no conflict between the various racial groups.
You've recently been released from prison. You are currently out on medical parole. How is your health at the moment?
So I'm very grateful to Almighty God for that, but I really have a reasonable quality of life today. My lung cancer is in remission, and I'm quite comfortable.
I've seen a picture of you and Lieutenant General W.R. van der Riet awarding you with a medal. Perhaps if you can just explain to us what that was about.
Well, you know, I served for many years in the citizen force. I eventually ended up as commanding officer of the Witwatersrand Rifles Regiment, and that medal that General van der Riet was pinning on my chest was for efficient and meritorious service.
And you were the youngest commander of that regiment, is that correct?
And I believe I'm still classified as the youngest ever.
You were involved with the National Party at one stage, and then there was a time when you left the National Party and you joined the Conservative Party. So what was the reason? Why did you join the National Party initially, and what made you leave the National Party and join the Conservative Party in 1982, I presume?
I've always been politically aware. At school, I decided that I wanted to make some sort of a contribution as an English speaker, because I criticized the English-speaking community for not being sufficiently involved in the government sector of South Africa. So I decided to try and do something about it. When I left school, I did military training. I did voluntary training for a period of 19 years. And during that period, I met a gentleman by the name of Charles Stallard. He was a colonel of the British Army in his own right. He was also an advocate. He was a member of Parliament at one stage for Roodepoort, and he was a member of Smuts' coalition government in 1940, in the 40s. He had a lot to do with my getting involved in politics, because he was of the opinion that I should get involved because South Africa needed people like me in politics. And when I decided eventually to stop my military career, I went to him for advice, and he told me exactly how to get involved in politics. And he told me outright, he said, don't waste your time with these other little parties. Go straight for the National Party and get involved there and make a difference.
As an English-speaking South African, would you say, especially within the politics of the Conservative Party, did that put you in an advantageous or a disadvantageous position?
Well, I mean, obviously it was advantageous because of my fluency in English. I was eventually given the position of PR for the Conservative Party, and handled most of the television interviews from overseas media who inquired about the Conservative Party policy. But the English-speaking story, of course, is quite interesting. I grew up as an English speaker, and it was only when I went to Parliament that I discovered that our branch of the family was the only English-speaking branch, and that we were all actually Afrikaners.
Obviously, a person can have many identities. You can be a Afrikaans-speaking person, or you can be a white South African, or you can be a South African. Which identity of yours would you say do you hold most dear? Would you describe yourself as an Afrikaner, for example?
I would describe myself as an Afrikaner in the terms of General Hertzog's definition. General Herzog said that anyone who puts South Africa first, English or Afrikaans speaking, is a South African, is an Afrikaner. And based on that, I devoted almost my full political life towards promoting that image, and also towards convincing English speakers that they were Afrikaners and they shouldn't be upset if people spoke about the future of their Afrikaner because they were included. In fact, it was quite interesting that I eventually agreed, or got the people to agree, that instead of calling ourselves a folk, which is a concept which people don't understand, we should call ourselves a tribe, because we are the white tribe of Africa.
You were opposed to the releasing of Nelson Mandela in 1990. What was the reason therefore?
Well, I was certainly opposed. The most important reason was that he refused to repudiate or disassociate himself from violence. With an attitude like that, you couldn't release the man. I mean, he had to renounce violence.
But wouldn't you say that apartheid was dead in any case, and that certain changes had to be made?
Changes in what regard?
Political reforms, releasing Mandela, unbanning the ANC.
You know, the amazing thing about this whole story is that political reforms were already introduced by the National Party years before, under Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd. The policy of separate development, which the media mischievously branded apartheid with the accent on the HAT, hate, That was a policy which was aimed at developing the various African tribes to the stage that they were able to competently govern themselves. I mean, that political reform is unbeatable in world terms. In fact, what would eventually have happened in South Africa is we would have had something similar to the European Union, where we had self-governing sovereign states all cooperating for the benefit of everyone.
So if the concept was self-determination and separate development, what went wrong? Why did the system not work at the end of the day?
Well, you know, the system did work. In fact, when there was a survey done in 1978, just before P.W. Botha announced that it wasn't working, and it was discovered that at that stage, an average of 72% of all of the people of the various tribes were either resident within their traditional territories or on the outskirts, attracted by the factory employment and whatever which was available. So 72%, I believe, is a success story.
Yes. So after the removal of the declaration that the ANC was an illegal organization and the release of Mandela, the negotiations started, and it quickly became a bilateral process between the National Party and the ANC, the negotiations for a new South Africa and a new constitution. But you were involved in the leadership of the Conservative Party at the time, but the Conservative Party boycotted the negotiations. Do you believe that this was a fruitful strategy?
Well, first of all, I think we must clarify the situation regarding the negotiations. There were already subtle negotiations going on within the National Party long before 1990. In fact, I know that, for example, the Broederbond chairman, Piet de Lange, had a meeting in London with prominent leaders of the ANC. There were also other academics, and Piet Miller of now Media 24, he was the first guy who started talking to the ANC. The Democratic or the Progressive Federal Party also had their meetings with the ANC negotiating. You know, at one stage, Dr. Connie Mulder was thrown out of Parliament because he allegedly lied to Parliament about the establishment of the Citizen newspaper. Now, when I was in Parliament, I got there in 87. In 88, I used to get tips from anonymous people, which I presumed were national intelligence or security branch guys, but really good information against the government. And I got a call one day to say that the government were in discussions with the ANC, secret discussions. Now, in 1987, the National Party really took the wind out of the Prog Party, PFP's sails, because of their meetings in Dakar with the ANC. They roasted them with that. And I now have this information in 1988 that the National Party cabinet ministers are talking to the ANC. Now, the only way I can confirm this is through a question, put it on the order paper. So I put the question to P.W. Botha as the president. Are you or any of your cabinet ministers holding discussions with any leading members of the ANC? The answer came back, no. Then I sent a question to each minister individually. Are you engaged in discussions with prominent members of the ANC? And the answer came back, no. Now, I went to the caucus for that when I got the initial information, and I got a mandate to handle the matter. And I thought, oh, I've got to find, you can't ask the same question twice. So I had to find a wording which would give me access to a direct answer, where they would have to give me an answer, yes or no, that they were. And I put the question in the order paper. And the next thing I get a call from Frank LaRue, the chief whip, go to his office. He says, listen, he says, I've just come back from talking to Kobie Coetzee. As you know, he was the cabinet minister, he was Minister of Justice at that stage. He said, and that question that you asked about discussions with the ANC, you're not going to get a satisfactory answer. I said, oh, why not? No, he said, well, we've agreed. Kirby put it to me very clearly that answering that question of yours would not be in the national interest. And so he's not going to give you your answer. And I assured him that you wouldn't give any follow-up questions on that question. And I said, okay, who gave you that right? I said, I was mandated by the caucus. No, he said, you know, national interest and so on, it takes priority over anything. And I had him lambasted at the following caucus meeting because, I mean, he had no right to do that. And in fact, he saved the National Party because, I mean, you can imagine what would have happened if it came out in 1988 that the National Party, contrary to what they said about the the PROGS, PFP, meeting with the ANC, were doing exactly the same thing. And it would have brought them down in 1989. But the important part of the National Party negotiations, that I believed that they were negotiating with the ANC to ensure their future position in a black-ruled South Africa.
So, putting it that way, do you believe that the National Party was dishonest in the way it communicated to its constituency?
They were totally dishonest. In fact, de Klerk himself was dishonest to his own constituency, because that announcement that he made releasing Mandela and unbanning the Communist Party and the ANC, he made on his own. He didn't even discuss the matter with his caucus before he did it, which is the so-called democratic process. So he had already taken dictatorial rights and decided for the people. He then, of course, pulled a complete swindle with the 1992 referendum, when he got such a thumping in Potchefstroom and previous to that in Virginia and the Free State. He was morally obliged to call an election because it was clear at that stage that the electorate had rejected the National Party. Instead of that, he called a referendum. He concocted a very vague question which people encouraged people to vote yes. They threatened people with their jobs. They threatened that sport wouldn't take place in South Africa anymore. The whole thing was based on threats to intimidate the voter into voting yes. And in spite of that, there was still a considerable percentage of people who voted no. In fact, if you check the figures of voting, you will find that, for example, in the region controlled by P.W. Botha, 15 constituencies, that they had a 105% vote, which I'm sure you'll agree with me is quite ridiculous. Yeah, I think the major mistake was entering and participating in the referendum. You know that we wanted an election, and we knew that we could win an election. The figures in Potchefstroom and Virginia indicated this. So we had to obviously take a decision. Now, at that stage, there was talk of a possible referendum, and the executive of the General Council had already said, we're not participating. And before the referendum was announced, you know, the guys, when they've got nothing to do at Parliament, they go back to their constituencies to see what's going on and so on. And this particular week, the chief whip of the CP, Frank LaRue, instructed Chris Hani, who was the whip on duty, that should there be any announcement regarding the referendum, he must call all of the guys back to Parliament so that we could discuss it in caucus, which he never did. So the announcement was made. We had a caucus meeting on the Thursday, and unfortunately, Ferdy Hartzenberg wasn't there as chairman. He was replaced by Tom Langley, and we only had 24 of the 44 caucus members present. The vast majority of the others who were not there would certainly not have voted for participation in the referendum. But when somebody stood up, I don't remember who, and said, we must debate this and we must take a vote, Tom Langley agreed. He approved it as chairman of the meeting. Came to the vote, and it was 12 for and 12 against. And then I think that Dr. Andries Treurnig made the biggest mistake of his political career and the CP's biggest mistake. He said, because he didn't want to be responsible for breaking up the Afrikaner unity, he would also vote in support of the participation. And so we went to participate. Now the problem with participating, of course, was that had we not participated, the democratic movement would not have participated either. There would have been nothing at stake. But when we decided to go into it, they decided that to keep us out, to kill the no vote, they would vote with the National Party. And I believe that had we not participated, de Klerk would have battled to get a 30% support for his right to continue to have the referendum.
So let's talk about that by-election of Potchefstroom in Potchefstroom from 1992, which led to this referendum where white South Africans had to vote whether the National Party should continue with negotiations or not.
Yeah.
Would you agree if I were to say that by-election indicated a significant shift in politics in South Africa, leaning towards the Conservative Party away from the National Party?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if my memory serves me correctly, the political pundits were saying that the result in Potchefstroom indicated that at that stage 56.8% of South Africans would support the Conservative Party in a general election.
And then there's another question about that election is that I'd like your opinion on, if whether you believe that sort of indicated a degree of inconsistency within the Conservative Party, because the person who was the candidate in that election was an office bearer of the Conservative Party, and in 1982 there was a similar election in Germiston. Maybe you can just explain that comparison. And do you believe that there was an inconsistency?
Yes, well, as far as I was concerned, there was, because I was personally involved. In 1982, shortly after the Conservative Party was established in March, there was a by-election in Germiston district in August of that year. The local community wanted me to be the candidate. The General Secretary at that stage was a man by the name of R.C. van Wyk. And I think he was of the old school National Party who really didn't trust English speakers. And so, of course, he vetoed my candidacy in Germiston District because I was actually part-time working for the Conservative Party. With Andries Beyers, who was the General Secretary, was a full-time employee, and yet he was approved as the candidate for Potchefstroom. So I think there were certain discrepancies there.
Dr. Andries Treurnig was the leader of the Conservative Party, and he passed away in 1993, if I recall, and you got to know him quite closely. What was your view on him as an individual?
Well, I always admired Dr. Treurnig and respected him. In the first place, Andries Treurnig was a politician who had no skeletons in his cupboard. He was untouchable, and that is why the media detested him so much, because they couldn't come up with some other scandal. He was a leader respected by everyone in the party. He led through example. I believe that, in fact, he was a bit too decent, because at one stage I had information of F.W. de Klerk's affair with the Greek lady that he subsequently divorced his wife for. And I wanted to raise the matter in Parliament because I believed that it could have brought about de Klerk's downfall. And Treurig's answer to me was, that's not our style, Clive, leave it.
He died, as I said, in 1993 under slightly suspicious circumstances, and there are some who believe that he was murdered, that he didn't die from a heart attack. Is that your view as well?
Well, I'm not sure, because at that stage I was in prison, But I must mention that Dr. Connie Mulder also went to that same hospital for treatment when he was, as far as I was concerned, fine. Dr. Connie and I were personal friends, and we had a close relationship. And he was getting better. His hair was growing back after the chemo, and he looked fit, and he was keeping fit. And he suddenly was called for a checkup at the same hospital that Dr. Journeys was taken up, and he never came out of the hospital. And then Dr. Journeys, under similar circumstances, okay, he had a heart attack, but he was very fit, I know, because we used to sometimes train together in the grounds of Acacia Park. And for him to suffer a sudden death like that, it certainly leaves suspicions.
Don't you think perhaps maybe the whole story with Chris Hani and your conviction might have played a role, or do you think there were other factors?
I don't know. You know, that's something which will always, I think, puzzle a lot of people, but I don't think that had any effect on it.
You were particularly involved also with the internationalizing the cause of the Conservative Party, and as you said earlier, you were the PRO as well. But the impression that I get was that there was broad consensus among the world that apartheid was already on the way out. Do you think you were able to sell or to market the position of the Conservative Party, and did you make any progress in this regard?
Well, yes, you know, the most important reason for our visit was to inform the business community overseas what our policy was. And we had a final interview with the president of the Union Bank of Switzerland. And after Dr. Jenny spoke to him and outlined our policy and what have you, he said to this president, he said, "What would your feeling be if the Conservative Party became the government in South Africa?" And the president's answer was a simple one. He said, "We only look for one thing in a country, and that is stability. If there's stability, we will invest, because we know in South Africa we can make good benefits out of our investments. So if you ensure stability, that's all we want. We don't mind what your policy is."
And how would a Conservative Party government have been different than a National Party government? Would it implement the same policies, or would there be changes in the way the system was implemented?
Well, you know that the policy of separate development was so successful that there were 4 self-governing territories who had total sovereignty finally. It was the Transkei, the Ciskei, Venda, and Bophuthatswana. Bophuthatswana was the surprise of all, because those Tswanas people took it so seriously that within a period of something like 3 or 4 years, they became an exporter of agricultural products, which made them one of 3 African states, the other 2 being South Africa and Botswana, who were actually able to export agricultural products. So it was a success story. The Venda government were very successful with their tourism. The Ciskei government were very successful in effecting industrial development. The only flop was the Transkei, and that was because those people were too arrogant to do anything themselves. They just sat there and reaped the benefit of massive financial injections from the National Party government and did very little to develop their people.
So, with the benefit of hindsight, and from a strategic perspective, what would you say, because at the end of the day, the Conservative Party did not succeed in taking over the government, so what would you say were the biggest mistakes that the Conservative Party made?
Well, the biggest mistake we made was trusting de Klerk. I mean, we expected him to behave like an honourable person, which he had no intention of doing. He was determined to betray us. All of those negotiations and discussions that they had illegally, and I almost exposed that at one stage with Nelson Mandela and company, they were all aimed at securing their own position in the future with a black-dominated government. And the fact that, as you know, after 1994, they became part of the combined government confirms what my suspicions were. But I actually in 1990 issued a information pamphlet in my constituency in Krugersdorp under the heading of Oorgawe, in other words, surrender. And I outlined the process that I believed was going to be followed by the National Party government in their determination to betray us. And with a few date problems, what I forecast exactly took place.
Why particularly Chris Hani? Why not Nelson Mandela?
That could render South Africa ungovernable. At that stage, I still wasn't convinced that it was the right thing to do. And this is something which didn't come out generally.
So let's talk about Chris Hani and what happened there. Why particularly Chris Hani? I asked you that question earlier, but why not Nelson Mandela? Why did you not decide to go for Nelson Mandela or for Thabo Mbheki?
Okay. Chris Hani was a man who, because of his hardline approach, had the support of the radical youth. We wanted South Africa to be delivered into a state where they couldn't govern any longer. And then the security forces would have to declare martial law. They would take over, they would restore law and order, and then elections would have to be arranged. And in that election, according to all of the fundis, we would have won the election, we would have become the new government. We would, of course, have continued with the policy of separate development, because it was working, it was successful. Even KwaZulu-Natal, under Chief Buthelezi, was governing itself. All of the other states, although they didn't accept independence, they were governing themselves. And they were doing it gradually and very effectively. And had that been allowed to continue, we would not have had the chaos that we have today.
So you are a devout Christian and you speak about it quite openly. How do you rationalize the decision that was taken in terms of your religion?
Well, you know, we were in a state of war. Unfortunately, the security forces controlled it so well that the average man in the street had no idea. The only people who were really aware of the fact that we were at war were the relatives and friends of youngsters who were killed on the border, engaged in the war against SWAPO and the East Germans and the Cubans, and we had lots of casualties. But it was far away. In our cities and towns, things were peaceful thanks to the government. The control was thanks to the security forces. The control was good. So people didn't realize there was war. But in wartime, anything goes. And I believe that one of the big problems with Chris Hani was that as an ardent communist, he didn't believe in the Almighty God anyway. And I saw him as being part of the Antichrist.
So if you can maybe take us through the process, what happened, or at what stage did you involve Beno Walus? Because you were not the one who pulled the trigger.
No. Okay, Janus was an interesting story. You know that because there was this rift between English and Afrikaans speakers, I initiated an organization called the Sellout Foundation, which was a vehicle which we could use to get to English-speaking people, to tell them what our political policy was and how the English-speaking community fitted into it. Janus became interested and he came to a meeting of ours and became quite involved with the Sellout Foundation after that. And he used to come and visit regularly and we used to have political discussions. And when de Klerk closed the democratic route by forbidding or by banning elections at parliamentary or municipal level, it was clear that there was no longer a democratic process available. And so I, as one of the senior members of the CP, sat back and thought, now how do we stop this? Because this is going to be a takeover of our country, which we must prevent. How do we do it? And I came to the conclusion that to take out somebody like Chris Hani, who had a big following amongst the radicals, who would certainly have rioted on the occasion of his death, that could render South Africa ungovernable. And that was and when I discussed this, Walus and I used to have many discussions. And I discussed that with him, and he said, well, you know, if we had to do something like that, because I suggested that we take out a high-profile figure, he said he would be prepared to do the shooting.
So was that an instruction that you gave to him, or was it a discussion between the two of you and an agreement between the two of you?
Well, obviously, I mean, I couldn't instruct him to commit murder. He volunteered to do it, but it fitted in with the plan. And as far as I was concerned, it was a political objective, and I was justified in that I was such a senior member of the Conservative Party in getting him to agree, well, you know, accepting his offer and saying, okay, you want to do it, you do it, but keep me out of it.
So in how much detail was it discussed? Did you plan on a particular date? Did you plan on going to Chris Hani's house?
No,
or?
No. And in fact, I must say here, and this is something which didn't come out generally, I had a silencer fitted to a weapon which I had because we were collecting weapons in case de Klerk cancelled all weapon licenses. So we had to have unregistered weapons. And I obtained this 9mm, and I wanted to fit a silencer to it so that I could use it at home without disturbing the neighbors. So I had the silencer fitted, and it just happened to coincide with Walus's request where he said, I need an unlicensed weapon, which I could then give to him. But the weapon with a silencer on needs a special type of ammunition, and I undertook to get that ammunition for him. I also used it as a way to retain control, because at that stage I still wasn't convinced that it was the right thing to do. But unfortunately, I didn't know that Walus had his own 9mm pistol. And he took the one that I provided, he tested it, he found problems with the silencer because the thing had to be cocked every time you wanted to fire a shot, and so he dispensed with the silencer. He then went and bought ammunition for his 9mm, and he used that in the weapon which I provided.
So you didn't agree on a particular date. How did you hear about it on the news, or how did you hear about this?
Well, it was quite, we were actually visiting friends who had just moved into Krugersdorp to welcome them. We were having tea and the telephone rang, and this friend's wife answered the phone, and she came back and said, oh, Chris Hani's been shot. And of course, when I heard it, I had a tremendous feeling of relief, because I knew that because I had the ammunition which he needed, it couldn't have been Walus who did it. And then I found out on the Sunday that it was actually him, and I can tell you it was quite a shock.
So how did you find out when he was arrested?
Yeah.
I know he was seen by a witness who went to the police. How did it come to be that he was arrested in the first place, and then also how did it come to be that you were arrested with this particular?
Well, you know, we were discussed the thing, obviously, and I organized a big purple wig for him to wear should he do it, and so that people would look at the wig, they wouldn't see his face, and they wouldn't be able to identify him. He was also supposed to change the car registration and you know, that sort of thing. Otherwise, the arrangements were his. The only instruction that I really gave him was that no one else but Hani should be harmed in this case. If he had bodyguards, it's off. You don't do it on that day. And he just happened to be patrolling the Dawn Park area where Hani resided, and saw that Hani didn't have bodyguards, and he thought, well, this is the golden opportunity. But I expressly said to him, not on the Easter weekend, because the Easter weekend was a time when it's holidays, people would be at home.
So he was then arrested 2 days after the...
No, he was arrested the same day.
The same day.
In fact, instead of going onto the highway where he would have been lost, he drove down the main street of Boksburg for some strange reason. And a couple of policemen were driving along. They pulled up next to him, looked, and he met the description that this person had given, in the call, and they arrested him. But of course, I wasn't arrested. The reason why I was arrested because after a week's of interrogation, the security branch people filled him up with beer and managed to convince him that they were on our side politically and that they wanted to warn me, so he must tell them quickly who else was involved so that he could warn us so that we could get out of the country. And that's how I then became connected.
And there was also a domestic worker, I think, that testified against you about the firearm, if I recall. Is that correct?
Yes. Now, that was another strange situation. In the trial, the question of the handing over of the weapon was essential to the circumstantial evidence case which the state was building, because they knew we weren't going to testify, because they'd been taping our legal visits and all sorts of, getting up to all sorts of skullduggery. So they knew we weren't going to testify, so what they did was they created a feasible circumstantial case to sink me. And of course, that was one of the links where she supposedly saw me hand over the weapon to Jonas. But it was impossible for her to have seen that, because if you have a look at the house, and I actually sent a note to my advocate, Henny de Vos, who's now a judge, and I said to him, look, ask for an in loco inspection, because it will be clear from that she couldn't have seen anything about handing over, and that would break down their circumstantial evidence. But of course, he just ignored it.
I would especially like to hear your view on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and your application for amnesty. Firstly, would you believe that your process, looking back at the TRC, do you believe it was free and fair, and that there was a balanced trial or a balanced hearing? Well,
first of all, one of the stipulations for the Amnesty Committee was that it had to be representative of the demographic situation in South Africa. In other words, there had to be an Afrikaner on as well. Advocate Chris Hani, who was a colleague of mine in Parliament, was a member of the committee. He was bundled off by George Bezos, the advocate who represented the Hani family, and on the pretext that because at one stage on instructions from the CP, he lodged a case against Chris Hani. And Bezos said no, he would be biased, so he must withdraw. They replaced him then with Advocate Denzel Potgieter, a member of the coloured community. So the committee was no longer representative of the South African demographics. And, it was quite obvious afterwards, when I saw the judgment, that the whole process was a show. It was a showcase to show the people how the ANC government deals with opposition. We were traipsed all over the country. We were in Benoni, we were in Pretoria, we were out at Mamelodi, we were taken to Johannesburg. It was a circus, and it was obvious, just a showcase.
Well, it's quite well known that the ANC was also involved with political crime, so to speak. How did the ANC package their case against you, given the fact that the ANC was doing more or less the same?
Well, they didn't really package their case. I mean, my thing was done by Bezos on behalf of the Hani family, and then Advocate Mche, who was the Amnesty Committee advocate. And they brought all sorts of witnesses and what have you to testify. It was like a trial, but it wasn't supposed to be a trial. Like they said, it wasn't to victimize the Afrikaner. In the meantime, it was totally a Nuremberg form of victimization of Afrikaners. And if you look at the process and the people on their side who got amnesty and the difficulties the Afrikaner applicants experience, it became clear. There was one example that I like quoting. There was a fellow by the name of Palmer, Phama, who was in prison with me. He had shot dead 15 IFP supporters who were traveling in a combi on the East Rand to attend a reconciliation meeting with the ANC. So, I mean, they were aimed at peace, and here he wiped a lot of them out. But in the process, he also shot a traffic officer and killed him. When his application came before the Amnesty Committee, they granted him amnesty for the 15 IFP people that he killed, and they also granted him amnesty for the killing of the traffic officer, even though he didn't apply for amnesty for that murder. I mean, we had another case where a guy in KwaZulu-Natal walking past the house, and he sees lights on, and he's drunk. He goes in there and he shoots the people, kills them. That's a political deed. Young people go berserk in the Cape, and they stone American University student Amy Beale, stone her to death, belonging to no political organization except a concocted one, and they get amnesty.
Yes. And there's also the example of the St. James.
That was a disgraceful. St. James Church, there was the Heidelberg Tavern in the Cape. Innocent people were shot. I mean, how can you go into a church on a Sunday where people are praying and worshiping Almighty God and shoot at random and kill people? I mean, and then still have that classified as a political murder.
So explain that to me, because that was one of I don't think it was the only finding, but I think one of the findings in your case was that this particular murder was not politically motivated. But how was that argued, given that Chris Hani was the leader of the Communist Party? He was also commander of Mkhonto weSizwe, the military wing of the ANC. So how was that framed as not politically motivated, as opposed to, for example, the St. James massacre?
They actually drafted the legislation for the Truth Commission, for the amnesty, in such a way that there were all sorts of clauses which you had to meet. You know, when the interim constitution was agreed, there was a clause which stated that all political offences shall receive amnesty. And all that Parliament had to do was to create the vehicle for granting of amnesty. But with people like Nsebeza and Bezos and these people using their crafts to close the routes for various people, they included a clause that you had to be instructed by your political party. Now, I wasn't instructed by my political party, but I was, and I went to great lengths to explain that, I was in such a position in my party where I was the equivalent of a cabinet minister. Now, in government, cabinet ministers make decisions, and if they make the wrong decision, their party acts against them. I made the decision that in the interests of our freedom and the interests of good order in South Africa, that Hani's death became necessary. But they ignored that, and they used the clause that my party had not authorized it to prevent me from getting amnesty.
Yeah. Because that's the other question I wanted to ask you, was there seemed to be some tension between you and the leadership of the Conservative Party during the Truth and Reconciliation hearings, because you argued that you were acting on a political motive, and the Conservative Party tried to repudiate that. So is that an accurate description?
Well, they didn't try to repudiate it. They actually just put it in such a way that they said I may have thought that what I was doing was to the benefit of the party, but they didn't have a policy of violence. Well, the ANC also didn't have a policy of violence, but they perpetrated lots of violence. And it was accepted as their policy because it became the practice eventually. And there was a lot of violence from the Conservative side leading up to the handover. Bombs were exploded. I know a colleague of mine, Chris Hani, was instrumental in blowing up the Hillview High School and also the Krugersdorp Post Office. He got amnesty, in spite of the fact that the Conservative Party didn't order him to blow those places up. But they agreed he had a political motive. And that was the whole basis of my application. It was a political motive. There was nothing personal about the whole story. And although BISOS tried with all sorts of things, examining my financial records to see whether I'd been paid for doing it, they could come up with nothing. And they couldn't even come up with a broader conspiracy, although the SACP used this for years to keep me in prison.
There were 2 assassination attempts on your life. Do you believe that it was politically motivated?
There's no doubt in my mind, because at the moment you're drowning on your own blood. The death sentence has been abolished. I said, not for me. I'm still on death row.
Once you went to prison, I'm sure there must have been other inmates who were supporters of the ANC or the Communist Party or Chris Hani. Did this make you fearful? Did you need to put measures in place to look after your safety in prison?
Well, when I came to prison, they said that my life was in danger because somebody would kill me. I found exactly the opposite with my dealings with everybody. When I was in the maximum CMAX facility, I was probably with 300 odd of the most dangerous criminals in South Africa. And yet I never for one moment felt threatened. On the contrary, I find myself suddenly involved in all sorts of aspects of providing facilities for my fellow inmates. And the more I did, the more they involved me. And eventually I got to the stage where I had no time for myself anymore. I was too busy on the affairs of my fellow inmates.
But you were involved with different committees and projects in prison. Can you maybe just...
Yeah, well, when I was in CMAX, the authorities said I couldn't be involved with anything because I was in danger. And the inmates demanded, when they started a school to get the guys through matric, demanded that I teach them ethnology. And their motivation was that I'm the only white person they know who knows anything about black people. And so I taught ethnology for the matric class. I had 22 people in my class. I had ANC guys. I remember a guy like Boy Ndweni, Michael Shezi, Sipiwe Bolo. They were all ANC, ardent ANC supporters. They're all committed political murders and were waiting also for amnesty. But I had no problems with the guys. And at the end of the year, all 22 of my pupils passed ethnology, and one got a distinction. And I must stress, I've never taught in my life. I'm not a teacher.
And then I think in prison also there were 2 assassination attempts on your life. But that seemed to have happened later in your incarceration. So do you believe that it was politically motivated?
There's no doubt in my mind. In the first place, I was refused parole 4 times. After the 3rd time, I was due to come up in July 2013 for consideration. I appeared before the parole board. The parole board recommended that I be granted parole. The Correctional Services Council also recommended me for parole. So it would appear at that stage that there was no ways that they could avoid granting me parole. And I think that somebody in the ranks of the CP decided, well, if we want to get rid of him, prison's the ideal place. And suddenly, after 21 years in which I never received a scratch from any opponent in prison. Suddenly, within a month, I had two attacks. The first one, the guy, and both of the people who attacked me were people that I helped.
So you knew them?
I knew them well. I helped them with tobacco, with cigarettes, with food, with bread and fruit. And, you know, they used to come around and ask, and you help the guys because you don't know what their support base is. And those two guys, I mean, the one guy was a general in the 26ers. Now, the 26ers have a code.
That's the prison gang?
That's a prison gang, yeah. The Wetsline, as they call them. And they have a code which stipulates that, first of all, you don't attack any elderly person. And secondly, if you want to attack a high-profile person, you must first get authority from the executive, which wasn't ever done in my case. This guy was a general. He said he took it upon himself to make that decision. And he came along with a cock and bull story that I had made insulting remarks about Mandela, which was as far from the truth as, you know, he being an innocent person was. So that was a cock and bull story. But he attacked me with a ladle, which they used for stirring the porridge in the big pots. He went for my head. Fortunately, my reflexes were good and I could ward it off, and he snapped my arm off with the impact of the blow. The second attack was a month later. Another youngster used to come regularly looking for cigarettes and stuff. And he came in. He wasn't supposed to be in the section. He was already supposed to have been locked up. And my section should have been locked because the two members, we had three members. Two were upstairs with the big cells closing them, and the one guy accompanied a couple of blokes to take the equipment back to the kitchen after the 4 o'clock meal. He should have locked the gate. He didn't lock the gate. This guy came in, walked up the passage, greeted everyone, friendly, came back. I was talking to somebody. I had my back to him, and he suddenly stabbed me with a sliver of glass. Stabbed me in the back, penetrated my lung, and that was the story.
And you almost died as a result of sitting down after that attack?
Well, and what happened was that eventually, after getting somebody to fix me up after an hour, the sister disinfected my wound and stitched it. Now, she should then, according to procedure, have sent me to hospital for x-rays, which she didn't. She sent me back to the cell. Fortunately, my doctor had obtained an urgent order to ensure that I come to hospital on the Monday for an operation on my chest to remove skin cancer. And when I got there, he said, you know, he examined me and so on. He said, we're going to take x-rays, but you'll go into the theatre tomorrow for the cancer operation. He came back that same afternoon. He said, no, you're going into theatre right now, because at the moment you're drowning on your own blood. Your lung was penetrated, and it's been bleeding ever since then. And so I was shot in, and that's with X-ray then also indicated that I had lung cancer.
Oh, I see. So, in talking about the process of getting medical parole, there's been especially two very high-profile cases of well-known prisoners trying to get medical parole, and you are, of course, one of them, and the other one would be Shabir Shaik.
And then, of course, Jackie Salebi, the former police chief.
So, yeah, let's use those two examples. What would you say were the main differences? Because it seemed that in your case it was a much harder, a much longer struggle to get parole. Why is this the case?
Well, it was interesting. Shabir Shaik was granted medical parole because he had hypertension. When I was admitted to hospital in 2010, it was discovered that not only did I have gangrene in my leg, that I also had hypertension, a severe case of hypertension, and I also had skin cancer. Then my lawyer applied for medical parole, and they rejected it. And, you know, they just reject it. The minister has the authority to reject. So they rejected my medical parole. Then when I went back to hospital in 2014, as a result of the stabbing, I was examined again, but this time I was examined by a number of people from the Medical Parole Advisory Board. And they were, there was conflict as far as whether I should have medical parole or not, because they found that I had stage 3B cancer, and that wasn't sufficient for medical parole. So they rejected the medical parole. I then applied again for medical parole. No, sorry. They then sent 2 doctors because I complained, and I said, you know, this is it's ridiculous. They sent 3 specialists. The third guy, I don't remember, was an African, and then there were 2 Indian specialists, Dr. Wadi and Dr. Lalu. And they were both specialists in the field of pulmonology and that sort of stuff, pathology. And the other guy, I don't know, because he never ever examined me. And after they did the examination, the 2 Indian doctors recommended to the Medical Parole Board Advisory Board that I should be granted parole, and the African guy said no, although he hadn't examined me, and these 2 both gave me thorough examinations. Anyway, so, you know, I then had a case to go to court. And we went to court, and the judge asked, you know, what the story is. How can you, what are you trying to do with this man? He's got stage 4 cancer, according to 2 specialists out of 3, the majority, and he then ruled that I had to be released immediately on parole.
And then also after your trial, you were on death row as well.
Yes, I was on death row. You know, that big fanfare was made about the abolition of the death penalty and what have you, but the news only reached me in the year 2000. And it was quite interesting when we had the amnesty hearing in the Pretoria City Hall. Judge Wilson, one of the committee members, came over to ask some question, and then I said to him, but I'm still on death row. He said, but that's ridiculous. He said, the death sentence has been abolished. I said, not for me. I'm still on death row. And he was quite shocked.
So you were never involved about S versus Makwanyana, that's the court case that declared death row to be unconstitutional?
No,
You're not informed of that?
No. Well, I mean, we knew, but, you know, they hadn't applied it to us. They left us there until the year 2000 before they finally said, no, you're no longer under death sentence, you're now sentenced to life imprisonment.
The widow of Chris Hani, Limpo Hani, said in court that you've never made any attempt to reconcile. Why is that the case?
Well, of course, that's a lot of rubbish. Every time I attended a parole board hearing, I expressed my desire to meet with them. She refused point blank. The last time, the penultimate time that I asked to meet her was during a parole board hearing at which she was present. And I said to the chairman of the parole board, I said, Mr. Chairman, Mrs. Hani is now here. Can't we now organize an opportunity so that we can express our regrets to her and her family? She refused to see us. She said we must make an appointment with a lawyer. And then, of course, when I was in hospital, my advocate extended an invitation to the SACP to organize for Mrs. Hani to come and see me in the hospital. And she refused point blank. So that story about the remorse, and the judge found that, finally, that the parole board had found that I had expressed remorse, and so did the National Services, Correctional Services National Council find that when they made their recommendations. And so he reprimanded the minister, in fact.
So the invitation was directed to the SACP, but the SACP also said that you've never reached out.
Yeah.
So how did that happen?
Well, I mean, you know, the SACP, what they say, you've got to examine very carefully because they are blatant liars. I mean, this whole question of the conspiracy which they keep on clinging on to, is so obviously a lie that was exposed at one stage by the Pretoria News editor when he wrote an article on the whole story, and he said, you know, if it is true that the SACP have evidence of a further conspiracy, they are actually defeating the ends of justice and should be charged for a crime.
Is that the Thabo Mbheki conspiracy that you're referring to?
Yeah.
So, because that's one of the suggestions that we hear, that maybe Thabo Mbheki might have been involved with this, with the killing of Chris Hani.
Yeah.
So that was not the case?
Well, I was interviewed at one stage in prison by the then Minister of Safety and Security, Steve Tshwete, and the then Minister of Justice, Beno Walus, who came to confront me, to ask me whether Mbeki had anything to do with it. And I said to them, I don't know Mbeki from a bar of soap. I've seen photographs of him in the newspaper, but I would never talk to Mbeki because he's from the ANC, and the ANC are my enemies.
But, I mean, if you've been convicted of murder, surely saying that Thabo Mbeki made you do it might have strengthened your position. So why did you not, if you've already been convicted of murder and you say Thabo Mbeki was not involved, why didn't you just say that he was involved?
Well, you know, I'm someone who works on the truth. My whole political career was crowned by the fact that nobody could catch me out with a lie because I only used facts. And I wasn't going to use a lie to get myself out on the pretext that Mbeki was involved. But in any case, the ANC and the SACP knew that he wasn't involved because they had a report which indicated that Chris Hani actually dispensed with his bodyguards the night before he was killed because he had an assignment with an air hostess from Air Transkei at the Holiday Inn at the airport. So, I mean, how would I know, or anybody be able to communicate to me so quickly that he had no bodyguards?
So you went to prison when F.W. de Klerk was still president, and you came out when Jacob Zuma was president.
Yeah.
How did you experience the political differences in South Africa?
The ANC do not have the answers. They would not be competent because they couldn't be, because they hadn't had the training.
So eventually parole was granted. Eugene Terblanche of the AWB also went to prison, and he came out saying that he was a changed man. Would you say that you are now a changed man, having gone through prison?
I don't think so. I'm the same person I was when I went into prison. My whole motto in life has been make a difference. I did it in the military, I did it in my personal life, I did it on council, and I did it in politics. And when I went to prison, I also decided that somehow I must make a difference. And I made a difference. I made conditions for my fellow inmates much, much better in the time that I was there. I was involved in all sorts of bodies. I used to organize family days. I was the first person ever to have organize a computer in prison, which opened study opportunities tremendously for the guys. In fact, you won't believe this, but for 3 years I was the chairman of the Soccer Association, controlling 20 soccer teams.
Mm. So you went to prison when F.W. de Klerk was still president, and you came out when Jacob Zuma was president.
Yeah.
How did you experience the political differences in South Africa?
Well, it was very obvious over the years, and I've kept myself informed, I've read newspapers and so on, that South Africa has deteriorated, it's gone down the slippery slope tremendously, and that the ANC do not have the answers. I was quite alarmed at when I was transported to the hospital to see the filth in the streets of the city of Pretoria. I mean, you know, those standards would never have been tolerated pre-1994. And it came as a bit of a shock, but, you know, that we expected it. I mean, we knew that they would not be competent because they couldn't be, because they hadn't had the training.
You said at one stage that the killing of Chris Hani was because you were acting in defense of your people. Is that still your stance, or looking back, do you believe that that was a mistake?
Under the circumstances at the time, I believed it was the right thing to do. Although I hadn't finally decided, I believed that that was the right thing to do, and that would be the only way, because he had the support of the radical youth who would certainly disrupt and make the country ungovernable, I hoped. You know, the whole object of an exercise is you must achieve what you believe you want to achieve. And we knew in the Conservative Party that to hand over to an ANC, SACP, communist-dominated regime would only mean disaster for everyone, not only for white people, for everybody. I mean, if you see what's happening now, the first president, Mandela, was at Xhosa. So, and Mbeki followed him. So the Xhosa's got all of the top posts. Then Zuma became the president, and then what happened? There's a transformation. It's now Zulus who get all of the top posts. In the meantime, the Tswanas and the Pedis and the Sutus and all of the others, they look at this and say, when are we going to get our share?
So was it worth going to prison for 22 years?
I didn't anticipate going to prison, obviously. But as I said, you know, my philosophy in life helped me, I think, to handle the prison environment, because I never really felt any different. I was doing things, I was getting things done, I controlled the stores. Everyone in my unit never ran out of toilet paper or toothpaste or anything like that, because I used to take my job seriously. I ran the administration eventually in my section. I used to inform the members when a guy should appear before the parole board, because I had the record of when he was due to get parole. I had all of those records which I kept to help and to make life easier for my fellow inmates.
And then lastly, what would you say is still ahead for Clive Derby-Lewis?
Time will tell. You know, at the moment I'm under house arrest, which is much better than being in prison, but it's very restrictive. I'm not even allowed to go to church on a Sunday, which I find is a total gross offence, violation of my rights. But my lawyers are looking at the whole matter, and hopefully they will do something about it.